Welcome to Weekly Infusion with Dr. Drew Pinsky and Dr. Bruce Heischober. Weekly Infusion addresses medically related topics. It's in the know, entertaining, and everything you want to know about health and medicine. Now may I present to you the very wonderful Dr. Drew and Dr. Bruce.
Welcome to the Weekly Infusion. Bruce, welcome. And we have a very interesting guest this week.
Yes.
Her name is Kate. She's a Sunday Times best-selling author. She is also an editor and ghostwriter. In 2015, she directed the production of These Shining Lives, a play about what we're about to hear about. I'm not going to tell you quite the details because it's a very powerful, inspiring, and interesting story, and it's a medical mystery.
Absolutely.
And so we're going to let that mystery play out across this episode, and perhaps in the next episode we'll tell you what that mystery, how it resolves. Kate, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You got it. Do you have a website before we get before we get into this?
Yeah, it's kate-moore.com.
Great. So how did you get interested in this?
So as you just mentioned, I directed a play called These Shining Lives. First of all, as a director, I felt this incredible responsibility to do justice to these real women who my cast and I were portraying on stage. And so I did lots of research. I read the other books that I could find about them, which, chart their position in legal history and chart the medical mystery that you're talking about, their kind of contribution to science. And I realized as I was researching, there is no book that actually is about the girls themselves, about the individual women, that tells their story from their own perspective, their point of view.
Where did this all start? Where did this story begin?
The story in history?
Yes, in history.
Okay, so the story opens in the First World War, really. So just before that, 1916, 1917, just before America joins the First World War. And these women in cities all across America, but in the book that I've written about these women, I'm focusing on two centers in New Jersey and in Illinois. And they are working in dial painting studios. And the reason we're setting the scene in the First World War is because what they're doing, as I've mentioned, is painting aeronautical dials. So, the dials and the luminous instruments that you see in aeroplanes, in ships, on trucks and things like that. So as soon as America joins the First World War, production booms. There's a massive demand for these dials, and therefore the dial painters who were creating them all and painting them all suddenly found that there was lots of work for them, and so they started recommending the job to each other, and that's where the story really kicks off.
So interesting. So this was a desirable job. Of course, there was a lot of nationalism, and people wanted to participate in the war effort.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a big part of it. And Grace Fryer, who's one of the key women that I talk about and write about in the book, was exactly as you say. She wanted to do her bit for her country. She actually had two brothers who were soldiers going off to fight in France. And therefore, even though she was already doing a very well-paid job, she actually moved to become a dial painter. But you're absolutely right when you said it was a desirable job. And that was for several reasons. It wasn't just kind of being a patriot that attracted these dial painters. It was the fact that the job was very well paid. The women were in the top 5% of female wage earners nationally.
Wow. Is there a reason that it was so lucrative for them?
Well, I think they were working in an industry where the material they were using was the most valuable substance on earth. I think it retailed for kind of the equivalent of $2.2 million for a single gram. So I think it was partly like a trickle down thing of working in that glamorous industry.
Did they see themselves as artists? Because I noticed they used little brushes.
Yeah, very much so. And that was a huge part of it. And actually, if you look up these women's names, so Catherine Donahue is another key figure. If you look her name up in her local town directory, next to her name, it says artist.
Oh, interesting.
Because that was their job. So
in addition to their hourly wage,
attractive.
In addition to the hourly wage, were they paid per amount of produced as well?
They weren't paid an hourly rate. It was entirely piecework.
I see.
So
interesting.
These women had to paint as many dials as possible, and therefore the company and they wanted to employ the most efficient procedure.
Was it sweatshop-ish, or was it a fairly pleasant environment?
It was an incredibly pleasant environment. The studio, or both the studios actually in New Jersey and in Illinois, had huge windows so that the girls could see the dials they were painting. So it was filled with sunlight, and it was full also of camaraderie. Because this was such a desirable job, and because there was such demand for it because of the war, these women would recommend the job to their friends, sisters, cousins, and so you ended up with, whole sets of siblings. So the Margia sisters, for example, Quinta, Albina, and Molly, they were all, sitting side by side at these long wooden desks, painting away. So it was very, very attractive place to work.
And then something started happening.
Yeah, not for a while though. I have to say, it was. This was a job that was a fun job, and these girls themselves, the dial painters, came from poor working class backgrounds. They were often the daughters or granddaughters of immigrants, delighted to have this job, and they were all teenagers as well. Most of them were teenagers, and actually, records show that some were as young as 11.
Was there a reason that they were young?
I don't think so, especially. I would just say the social kind of context is probably important in terms of the answer to that question, because married women tended to be older and married women didn't work on the whole. Okay. So the teenagers were the female workforce, and because of that delicate artistic work that we've described, that is why a lot of these young girls got the job. But one thing we should pick up on, actually, before we get into things going wrong that you asked about, is about the technique they were using. Mm-hmm. Because, as I say, these girls were told, emphatically that they had to paint as many dials as possible. And the most efficient procedure and the way they were taught, the technique they were taught, was called lip pointing, which meant that they tipped their brushes between their lips to get a fine point for the handiwork. So playwright Melanie Marnick called it a lip dip paint routine. And so these women, on some of them every number of every dial that they painted, were putting the brush between their lips and sucking slightly on the brush so that the bristles, which had spread with the material, came back to that fine point. Over and over again they were doing that.
Were they putting something in their mouth that was clearly covered with paint, or had they already washed it and there's something about this material we're going to discuss that sticks to the brush?
Well, they had water dishes. They were later removed by the company because the material would come off the brush, the paint would come off the brush in that water and leave a sediment, and because it was such a valuable substance, the company thought you're wasting too much material, so they took the water away. So then the only way was to put the paint-laden brushes into their mouths. So you're right, and they're kind of swallowing the material as they're going, but they're told it's perfectly safe. Before these women began using this technique, May Cubberley, who worked in New Jersey, she said to her boss, she said the first thing we asked was, "Does this stuff hurt you?" And they said, no, it's perfectly safe. And so the women happily lipped and dipped their brushes.
Do we know what they based that safety on? Was there anything like a work environment safety evaluation, or was there research that they would point at?
Well, there was some research which was funded by their company, and it was funded into this substance. And that research, according to their findings, said that the material was safe in small amounts. It was well known that it was dangerous in large amounts. So in the very same companies that we're talking about, where these dial painters, Grace and Catherine and Molly Margia, were working, you had this strange situation where the women were told the material was safe and they were putting it in their mouths. And then you had lab workers in the same company who were wearing lead aprons before dealing with this material, and they weren't allowed to touch it with their bare hands. So the research that we've talked about, the research that proved that this material was safe, was funded by the firms. And I think that may give us the reason as to why they thought it was safe, because in believing this material was safe, they didn't just use it for painting dials, they also put this material in all sorts of industries. You had it in cosmetics, in foods, in kind of health tonics and pills and things.
So people would
it was
drink
actually
this. People would be
craze.
And what the current day health tonic is that's got something like this in it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Marijuana.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it
Right.
had that kind of widespread appeal. So the girls, they check it's safe to put the paint, in their mouths, and they're told yes. And it's not just
Was
their
there any
boss.
correlation between the use of this stuff and there was sort of a health craze where they put this stuff in products for health? So were those coexistent, connected, or independent?
Coexistent and also interconnected in that it was the same firms supplying the material to all these industries.
Wow. And so what started happening?
So about 5 years after the war, so many of the girls are not necessarily dial painting anymore. They've moved on to other jobs. Grace is working in a bank. Quinta has quit her job because she has got married and is having her babies. And the girls start to get poorly. It's quite innocent to begin with. It might start with a kind of loose tooth, perhaps, or an aching limb. And what was confusing is that it was quite slight pains to begin with. Go to the dentist, have the tooth pulled, surely that will sort it out. But what happened was that every time they went to a dentist or a doctor, the specialists couldn't actually find out what was wrong with them. And they would try kind of established treatment. They'd pull the tooth and normally that should clear up something. But then the next tooth would start to hurt, and then the tooth after that, and the tooth after that. And even once those teeth had been pulled, ulcers then started to form in their place.
How long after the job did this begin to happen? After the job wrapped up?
It was about 3, 4, 5 years that the girls began to start getting problems in their mouth, and also other problems. So, a leg that would hurt, an arm that would ache, a back or your feet. And this was one of the really confusing things because there was such a wide range of problems. So Quinta MacDonald found that her hips were seizing up, and she peculiarly seemed to notice that one leg was getting shorter than the other. But in Grace Fryer, she didn't have any problems with her hips. She had a problem in her feet and in her back. And so as the women are kind of talking to each other, because, as I say, when they were dial painters, they were friends, they were sisters, those relationships are still there, even if they're not all working in the studio anymore. And so they're talking, but all their symptoms are different. And so their doctors that they're going to are not connecting it. And it's getting quite dramatic. So I'm describing there, one tooth comes out and then suddenly you've got 4, 5, 6, 7 teeth coming out. This is dramatic. You're losing your teeth. Ulcers are coming out behind them, which are constantly seeping past. So it's a horrific thing, bad breath. It's embarrassing. You can't eat. It's incredibly painful. And then with these aching limbs as well, one girl found she went dancing one night and slipped on the dance floor. And it was just a simple slip, but she broke her leg. The bone was so weakened that
what we call a pathological fracture, Bruce.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a spontaneous fracture sometimes. Sometimes you didn't even have to have that slip on the dance floor. The women found when they went for an X-ray that the bone had actually broken.
This what year are we talking about here? Early 50s?
14.
No. So this was First World War. They were dial painting. So we're now it's beginning of the Roaring 20s, basically.
So I would imagine that they were told they had cancer, because that's with the diagnostic ability back then, Bruce. That's all they could imagine, creating these spontaneous fractures, right?
Well, you would think that the doctors would first say something as serious as cancer, but they didn't. In fact, when the women went to them and they couldn't diagnose, what was wrong with these aching limbs and so on, they told the women they might have arthritis or rheumatism.
They're hysterical.
They sent them home with aspirin.
Yeah, they're just histrionic. They're just hysterical.
Yeah, exactly. And you're absolutely right. I think often, particularly because the girls are starting to talk amongst themselves and thinking, because they're young, they're teenagers when they're dial painting. They're only in their early 20s now. This shouldn't be happening to so many young women. And but people did say, you're hysterical. It's not, you're just kicking up a fuss about nothing.
This stuff could affect your brain, so they could have personality changes and stuff. It could affect your thyroid, so you could have all kinds of, weakness. I would assume it could affect your stomach or your intestines. So
well, but I'm trying to think in terms of, so we're now in the 1920s essentially, or for almost, and the diagnostic abilities they had then were nil. And so I can imagine these women coming in with aches and pains being classed aside. There's no way to diagnose anything if there's not inflammatory or some physical signs of something. Number two, then they start getting spontaneous fractures. You're just assuming that's cancer, right? You're just going to go, well, I'm sorry, we'll have to figure out well, it'll show itself in time, right?
Right. Except the people that discovered this substance.
No, but no one knows it's the substance yet. All they know is the women are showing up.
Right. What I'm wondering, they did discover this substance a decade or two before, and those people got some of these disorders, right? Did somebody put it together?
Is that the case?
It takes a long time, and I think what is interesting is that these girls are getting more and more sick, and what they're suffering is actually incredibly gruesome. So those mouth infections that I'm talking about actually start getting into the jawbone as well. And so there's a horrific case where Molly Margier goes to the dentist. She's had those teeth removed. She's suffering those ulcers, and she indicates that her jawbone is hurting. And her doctor, Dr. Kniff, reaches inside her mouth just to probe gently at the bone to see what he can feel with his fingers. And as he does that, the jawbone fractures against his touch, and he lifts it out of Molly's mouth.
Can you imagine that? So she pulled her like a.
He literally
almost like a
pulls
denture,
her jawbone
like a denture pulling out her jaw.
So that in the ER, I'd pass out. It would just be shocking.
And it's
It's funny. It's very funny. I saw a trauma case in medical school. The guy had his jaw split, and he was in a coma, and so the jaw was floating free in his mouth for like weeks because we couldn't do it. And I'll never forget that image of the jaw flying around.
Yeah, and I mean, this is horrifying because the girls are literally they're able to pick pieces of their jawbone out of their mouths. The bone is so weakened, and when they looked at the bone and examined it, it was found to be moth-eaten and honeycombed.
Are they getting attention, or are they being dismissed in some way? I mean, in other words, are they marginalized?
People are not investigating. They're all being misdiagnosed. So whether it's rheumatism, arthritis, pyorrhea, which is a common inflammation, of the infection of the jaw, or even other things, because these women are suffering these conditions that are almost seeming to kind of consume them from the inside out. Their bones are almost kind of decaying. They're diagnosed with necrosis of the jaw, which is, as I'm sure death of living tissue. So they're literally, and they're nicknamed actually the living dead because their bodies are kind of disintegrating and decaying, but these women are still alive.
Now, worldwide, was there a difference in pattern of recognition and response in Europe, Great Britain, United States, or is this mostly the American story?
It's largely an American story. Dial painting was happening across the world,
right.
But according to my research, there was only lip pointing in America. There was only that technique of putting the brush in their mouth in America, and so that's why there are these horrific cases. People did die also in other countries, but the cases that we know about were largely centered in America. And what I was going on to say, as I say, everyone's being misdiagnosed, but they're also being misdiagnosed with things like syphilis or gangrene of lung, pneumonia, tuberculosis, anything and everything, because the doctors can't connect these dots. They don't know what it is. And so the girls are dying, they start to die one after one. And it's only when a male employee of the firm finally also dies that the medical examiner for New Jersey steps up and does an autopsy on him and it's proved that it's this substance they're working with which has killed him. And it's only at that point that they turn their attention to these dying young women and start investigating what on earth could be causing all these different symptoms that the physicians can't connect the dots between.
I am guessing that it wasn't easy for that pathologist to make the diagnosis that it was from the paint, because what are they actually What are they actually dying of?
Yeah, right.
Sort of. What, like, do they get infections as complications later?
And also, this was totally new. This was a type of poisoning, because it was a poisoning. It was a type of poisoning never before seen in human beings. So this physician, Dr. Harrison Martland, actually had to devise tests of his own, creation to try and test what was happening. So he came up with a kind of, I think it was called an electrometer, which kind of measured, whether anything was coming from the women's skeletons, what was making those bones fracture when they went on the dance floor. He was looking to see if anything, if he scanned their bodies with this machine he created, was anything coming out.
He must have been suspicious. He must have been familiar with the effects of this elsewhere.
Were any clinicians or he himself affected by
taking care of them, for instance?
Taking care of them, or...
No, they don't. Okay. They don't seem to have been. And I think the key thing is that the women had ingested the substance, and so it was inside them, and that is why it was causing such horrific damage. I mentioned earlier in the program how the lab workers were protected with lead aprons. That was because they knew externally a large amount of this substance could kill a man, and so you imagine the women ingesting this, even though they were only handling small amounts, so it was considered to be safe. But they discovered that those small amounts, even if they were tiny, tiny amounts, once they're inside you, they cause many thousands of times damage greater than that on the outside.
Well, I was reading somewhere, I think this is right, that the woman that discovered this stuff, the lab manuals are still they don't let people touch them because have the same toxin.
They're so poisonous. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Well, how did people start going after the company at this point, or how did that play out?
Well, people were asking questions, and I think,
Kate,
that
before I'm going to ask the question again, then we're going to take a little break. So when we get back, we're going to talk about how the company responded as people started looking into this. All right, Kate?
Sounds good to me.
Hydrolite, of course, you've heard me rave about these guys. It's a product that I actually wanted to develop myself. I conceived of this. I knew it was needed. It was already in Australia, and now it is here. It works. The feedback is unanimous. Even though it's great to use, though, when you're sick or dehydrated, you can use it every day, especially now that the weather is changing. It's hot. So whether you're exercising or maybe you got seasonal allergies or you drank too much or you got vomiting or diarrhea, whatever it might be, you can reduce fatigue and keep feeling healthy as well. Once you've started feeling dehydrated, sometimes a little too late. So you want to stay hydrated. And rapid rehydration, if you do get dehydrated, requires a proper balance of sodium, glucose, and water. And nothing provides it like Hydrolite. I'm telling you, it's the same as an IV fluid via your mouth, via your enteral system. It's based on established, proven science, quite simply the best rehydration product out there. It comes in great flavors. They have those fizzy tablets. Also, they have a powder and a premixed drink. Compared to other sports drinks, Hydrolite delivers up to 4 times the electrolytes with 75% less sugar. Hydrolite solutions are appropriate for all ages, and each bottle or package includes easy-to-follow directions. All right, you can find Hydrolite at Rite Aid or online at Amazon or click through at drdrew.com. And for a limited time, our listeners save 30% on Hydrolite if you use the code DRDREW, Dr. Drew, HY at checkout. That is DRDREWHY. 30% off. Great deal. Do it. And we're back. And so, Kate, explain to us what happened. How did the company respond, or who actually approached the company? How did somebody even know to do that?
Well, it began actually, firstly, with the women themselves talking amongst each other, saying to themselves, we're all young women, even though we're suffering different symptoms, the only thing that connects us all is the fact that we used to work in this studio.
And so they would... To that point, it's whatever this, we're going to tell you soon what it is. They were still having bone development. They were still growing, and so there could be concentration in the bones,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
More than
absolutely. And
otherwise.
later when they studied it, the younger the women were when they dial painted, and remember that, most of them were teenagers when they started, the more likely they were to be affected by the substance.
That's interesting.
I have to say that their dentists and doctors also confronted the companies, and there's a kind of a scene that I recount in the book where, a dentist goes to the company officials and he says, if I had my way, I would close down your, company because you're killing people.
Were they still doing it? Were they still working with the material?
They were still all working it. And this is a really key point, because these women, and part of the reason I wrote about them is because of the way they responded to what happened to them, because they were determined to not only to hold the companies to account for what had happened to them, but also to protect the other workers, because the company's reaction when people do start asking questions and pointing fingers is to deny all responsibility.
Did the women go in and try to warn other workers or anything? It's sort of separate from their approach to the business?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, it's this kind of friendship network thing. So, people are seeing their friends getting these horrific conditions. Marguerite Carlo's jaw was eaten away by this substance to a mere stump,
Sure.
And, her friend Genevieve seeing that, it was not long before Genevieve quit.
Good.
And so the women were kind of getting the word out. And, it shouldn't surprise you that it was only at the point when women started quitting their jobs for fear of what they could see happening to their friends. It was only once there was a kind of production hold up because they couldn't get the staff that the company finally said, what, we're going to commission a report to look into this.
There must have been some reproductive consequences too, no?
There were reproductive consequences, yeah. So many of the women found that they couldn't conceive. And again, think about their ages. These are young women. They want to start families. They are marrying. They're hoping that, they're going to be successful in falling pregnant. Many of them found that very difficult. Those who did succeed often suffered miscarriages or stillbirths.
Were there any horrible outcomes? Teratomas and things? I mean,
I don't know what a teratoma is.
Just not good pregnancies. I mean, things that go full term but are just horrific.
I don't know about that. I haven't come across any of
like
that in my research, although it's entirely
babies,
possible.
Yeah, like
any thalidomide equivalents?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what I've discovered in the research is, and what is important to say as well, is that some of the children were absolutely fine, and I think if the mothers had their babies quite early on, recently after their exposure, those children seem to have been okay.
Oh, that's weird.
It was when women, I think because it takes so long, it's a very insidious type of poisoning.
Yeah.
So you didn't know you were sick to begin with. You were actually in the best of health, Now,
did the companies that produced the toxin, were they complicit in any kind of cover up, or was it just the luminous dial painting companies?
It was a complete cover-up from start to finish. So, they commission reports. If those reports don't say what they want to hear, they cover them up. They hire doctors to assure the women that they're safe, to put out, official reports that say, no, it's definitely not this substance, it's a bacterial infection, or, whatever excuse it is that they want to come up with. And, some of those so-called official reports were dismissed as more biased than science.
Collusion and fake news.
Wait, yeah, right.
Yeah,
but
yeah, exactly. I mean, you see it again and again, and this, as I say, we're talking kind of roaring 20s, the 1930s as well, into the Great Depression. This is before what we saw happening in the tobacco industry, for example, the way that was all covered up. But it's exactly the same kind of process that the companies went through, try and discredit the victims. So they hired private investigators to follow the women, to dig up dirt on them. The fact that Molly Maggio, for example, was buried on an erroneous death certificate of syphilis was cited, again and again to show, these are women who are not of a high moral standing. Therefore, why should you listen to a word they say?
And I think,
it's that kind of thing.
What's interesting is older doctors like myself, syphilis was called the great imitator, and it would be difficult. You probably bamboozle other doctors and the public, because syphilis created just a vast array of lesions and symptoms.
And they couldn't really diagnose it back then.
Right.
There was no way to really detect it. And it's making a resurgence We're number one here in Southern California,
Yes.
Los Angeles. Congratulations, everybody. It's, it's back. However, people are so cavalier about it because some tetracycline or penicillin takes care of it. But back then, it was devastation. It was tuberculosis and syphilis were sort of common, undiagnosed, chronic, severe, whatever illnesses, right?
And coming back with resistant strains, which is scary.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back around and ask again what Bruce asked. The company that actually produces the paint, not just the company, the Watchdial company, but was there involvement with the whole food chain of supply in that product?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is actually when the girls start painting, it's the same company. The company that's making the paint is the company, mining the substance and everything. So they are completely complicit because, they're frightened that, if people start believing these women that the substance is to blame for these horrific, gruesome, painful illnesses and symptoms and death that they're suffering, then not only does the dial painting industry go, but the industry that they're supplying this substance to, the cosmetics, the clinics, the spas, all of that goes as well. So there's an incredibly lucrative industry to protect at all costs.
Did you investigate how they did a cover-up like that? I mean, in other words, how do they colluded together? It's kind of crazy.
Well, I think it was one of those things, one of the things that was so hard for the women is that they had to overturn the received wisdom of the age. And that doctor we mentioned, Harrison Martland, he came up with those pioneering tests that proved it was the substance that had hurt the women. And yet he was completely discredited. They were really, it was one of those things where everyone thought it was safe. So it wasn't so much that, the companies had to collude to do that. That was what was out there. The hard thing for the women was to get their different story heard and believed. That was the tricky thing.
It's a very interesting story. And I wonder where it's had, did you look at where it's had correlates in the present? In other words, is it called back upon by the legal community? And is it something that has set a precedent?
In terms of the legacy, it had a huge legacy in terms of workers' rights, because these women embarked, because of the company refusing to admit responsibility, they embarked on a huge legal campaign which, established new precedents. It set up new laws to protect workers. It was a really kind of landmark case. And ultimately, further down the line, years down the line, the kind of changes that these women brought about led to the establishment of OSHA, which essentially has saved, 10,000 lives a year since it was established.
Let's take a little break here, a little extendo break, and then we'll come back with exactly what this product is, how it unfolded, how the company was attacked, or how the company finally was brought to heel, and then more about how it's had its consequences in the present day. Does that sound about right?
Sounds great.
All right, Kate, thank you so much, and we will continue the story in the next episode.
Remember, you can find all these podcasts at drdrew.com. The Dr. Drew podcast, the This Life podcast with Dr. Drew and Bob Forrest, and the Adam and Drew podcast, which is available 5 days a week. Find them all on iTunes and rate us 5 stars. Subscribe and get it first. And if you're really happy, click on the Amazon banner at drdrew.com to help support the show. We'll thank you for it. If you join the email list via drdrew.com/contact, we'll send you a weekly infusion newsletter with Dr. Drew's news. We're so grateful when you get in touch. We read all your emails and we'll bring you the subject matter you want to hear about.